Okay, again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tyler Harms. I'm the Executive Director of Iowa Young Birders, and on behalf of Iowa Young Birders and Wild Birds Unlimited in Ames, thanks very much for joining us this afternoon for our virtual event on tips for identifying waterfowl in Iowa. I really appreciate you taking time this afternoon. What I hope to talk a bit about this afternoon is obviously how to identify some of our common waterfowl species that we see in Iowa during migration. We'll also talk a bit about when is a good time to see migrating waterfowl during migration. And then at the end, we'll also have a brief quiz for folks. So we'll have an interactive time at the end, and you're also welcome to ask questions at that time as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, before I really dive into things too deeply, I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of terms, or a few terms for that matter, that I'll be referencing throughout the presentation this afternoon. And those terms refer to the different groups that categorize the waterfowl species that we see. And so I'm sure many of you have heard of the terms ducks and geese and know the difference generally between those two groups of birds, and we'll talk a little bit about the differences today. But importantly, what I wanted to make you aware of today is two different groups of ducks. So we can break the ducks down further into two different groups, and those groups are dabbling ducks and diving ducks. And the primary difference between species in those two groups is how they forage and the habitats that they utilize. So dabbling ducks, commonly known as puddle ducks, are species of ducks that we see using shallow water marshes and are feeding on the surface. So they don't submerge themselves underwater for feeding. They're typically just pulling food off the surface of the water, or perhaps even tipping upward to grab food underneath the water surface in shallow water. Diving ducks, on the other hand, are ducks that will completely submerge themselves underwater, and they'll dive down to the bottom to obtain food on the substrate, and they're often using deeper water habitats. So think of some of our deeper lakes in Iowa where we typically see diving ducks. And so I'm going to be referring to ducks as either dabbling or diving ducks throughout this presentation, and I just wanted to orient you to those two terms or two groups of waterfowl before getting in too deep here. So let's talk first a bit about when it is a good time to see waterfowl in Iowa. And this figure is a recent figure that was shared by the Iowa Department of Natural Resources as part of their fall migration survey. And you can see that right now, about the third week in November is when we really see, at least this year, seeing a peak in migrating duck numbers. So we've reached nearly 160,000 migrating ducks according to the DNR Fall Migration Survey. And so it's really these first few weeks in November when it's just a fantastic time to get out to our wetlands and lakes to look for migrating waterfowl. And oftentimes, if there's water, chances are there's going to be some species of waterfowl on that water, whether it be Canada geese or mallards or northern pintails. There's lots of different species that we can enjoy this time of year. So the figure on the left is from the Iowa Ornithologists Union publication called their Yellow Book, which compiles observations of different species throughout the year to, again, show us when's good times to view different species, individual species. And I've got a box here around October, November, and December, and this page has all of our common migratory waterfowl species in Iowa. And so what this figure shows is a breakdown of when might be good times to see certain species of waterfowl. So we know that the first few weeks of November are peak timing for migration for waterfowl, but we do see some species that arrive in Iowa and migrate through Iowa a bit earlier. And blue-winged teal are one of our earliest migrants, and we'll talk a little bit about blue-winged teal later in the presentation. But their peak migration is really in September and October. And if you find blue-winged teal on this figure here, you can see that the darker bars here indicate that they're moving through the state of Iowa primarily in September and October, and are really dwindling in numbers by November. A number of our other dabbling duck species, such as northern shoveler, northern pintail, and American widgeon, are also fairly early migrants. They start to migrate through Iowa in October, and we will still see them in November in small numbers, but they're primarily moving through the state in October. And then really, if you think about the habitats that these dabbling ducks utilize, again, those shallow water marshes, it makes sense that they tend to migrate through Iowa a bit earlier in the fall, because they need those habitats in order to obtain food during their migration. And oftentimes we start to see those shallow water habitats freeze up once we reach the cold temperatures in November. And so they have to move through the state before those wetlands really start to freeze up. Diving ducks, on the other hand, things like canvasbacks and redheads and ringneck ducks down here on the bottom of the figure, they peak really right now in November and December. And the reason for that, again, is because they're using those deeper water habitats that tend to take a bit longer to freeze up in the fall. And so they can take their time and start a bit later than those dabbling duck species. And then our geese and our swans, our bigger waterfowl, not surprisingly, because they're bigger, they tend to be a bit hardier, and they can withstand colder temperatures a bit better than some of the smaller duck species. We tend to see them peak in December, and even some species like trumpeter swans will spend the winters in Iowa through January and February. And so that's just a breakdown of how some of these different species, when they peak in Iowa and when it is a good time to see them. Okay, so now that we know when we want to go out and look for these really neat birds, let's talk a little bit about some ways in which we can start to identify them. And so if any of you have spent time in the field looking for waterfowl, you're probably well aware that oftentimes when you see them, they're either flying high in the sky, or you might be looking at them out on the water, but probably at a distance. And so what I'm going to start with when talking about tips for identifying these different species is ways in which we can loosely categorize them initially from a distance. And one of those ways is by flocking pattern. And so I have a few different flocking patterns illustrated on the slide here. The first of which is the typical V, kind of the common flight formation that we think of when we think of migrating waterfowl species. And interestingly enough, despite what we may have been taught as kids about flying Vs and ducks and geese, there really only is a small number of species that will utilize this flocking or flight pattern. It's primarily our goose species, or our larger waterfowl species like Canada geese and trumpeter swans to some extent will utilize a V pattern. There are some species of ducks that will do this as well. Some of our diving ducks like canvasback and redhead will often be seen flying in a V, but really the V formation is reserved for those larger species like Canada geese. On the other hand, we do also have a number of species actually that will flock and fly in loose groups, and really that's most of the duck species that will utilize this. So if you've ever seen large flocks of mallards migrating, or just large flocks of ducks in general, they very rarely will be flying in a V, but more just kind of in a loose group with really no semblance of organization. And so that's a good way to quickly tell if you're looking at a flock of waterfowl flying overhead. You can quickly tell, well, are they flying in a V? Maybe they're Canada geese or larger species. Well, they look like they're kind of more flying in a group. Maybe they're some smaller duck species. And then lastly, there are are some duck species that will utilize what we call this follow the leader approach. So they'll just be flying more in a straight line or in a loosely associated line rather than in a loose group or a typical V. And species that I often will see utilizing this this flocking behavior are like wood ducks. Sometimes northern pintails will utilize this flocking behavior. And so this is one way when you're seeing waterfowl flying overhead that you can kind of very quickly determine whether they're ducks or geese or perhaps even narrow it down to a few different species. So the next thing that I wanted to talk a bit about is silhouettes. And I have a couple of silhouettes boxed in here. We don't need to necessarily worry about the tree ducks because we don't see very many tree ducks in Iowa, although we are starting to see more black-bellied whistling ducks, which is a conversation for another day. But what I have identified here are the Martian pond ducks or the dabbling ducks, like I referenced before, and the bay and sea ducks or the diving ducks. And these silhouettes, much like the flocking pattern, can be really helpful for quickly categorizing what you're looking at from a distance. So these Martian pond ducks kind of take that typical duck form. Their legs are right smack in the center of their bodies. They're kind of a little bit more, I like to say, a little more short and squat. Whereas if you look at the diving ducks or even the Mergansers and the Ruddy duck, which we also see in Iowa regularly, you'll notice that their silhouette is a little bit different. They stand a bit more upright. Their legs are a bit further back on their bodies. Even species like the Mergansers and the Ruddy duck have a little bit longer tail. And that silhouette is very distinctive and should tell you right away that you're looking at a species that dives. And the reason for that is because they have those legs that are further back on their bodies. And birds that spend a lot of time underwater tend to have legs further back on their bodies because it allows them to be much more maneuverable underwater. Our Martian pond ducks, remember, aren't really spending any time underwater. They're feeding on the surface. And so they're using those legs more for just swimming around on the surface of the water rather than swimming around underwater. And so it's very rarely that we'll see ducks actually standing on land like this. Oftentimes we will see them sitting in the water, but the silhouettes that we're seeing here do translate very well to water as well. And you'll notice that after you spend a bit of time out looking at ducks in the field. The other thing I want to draw your attention to on this slide is different shapes and sizes. And we'll talk a lot about that when we start to talk about the individual species. But shape and size can be a really great identifying characteristic, especially when looking at ducks from a distance, in a distance such that you're not able to really distinguish any color markings or anything like that. Okay, and then obviously the last thing I wanted to talk about before we really start diving into the individual species here is color and physical features. And these are often the features that are really the critical pieces to tell which species we're looking at, and can be really characteristic if we're able to see them up close. Color can be difficult at a distance, or if ducks are flying by quite quickly, which they often do. But again, if you're able to really study them and look at them up close, or perhaps even at a distance, but have good viewing conditions, you can tell right away which species you're looking at based on the color and physical features. And we'll talk about those colors and physical features for each of our more common species here in a bit. But just a few things to note here. So drakes have brighter color patterns than hens for all duck species. So much like many other of the birds that we see, the males, or drakes in this case, a male duck is called a drake, have brighter color patterns than hens. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and I'll show some images of this on the upcoming slides is what's called the speculum, and that is the portion of the wing where the secondary feathers are that tends to have color in ducks. And that speculum is a really great diagnostic tool for identifying different species on the wing. And so I'll show some different speculums for different species that we see here in Iowa, just to show you how they can be very different for different species. And what this figure is doing here down at the bottom is just orienting you to the different parts of the waterfowl body, because it's these parts that we often reference when we talk about color and physical features. So things like the bill, the neck, the crest of the head, the breast and the side and the belly are often different colors and can be good diagnostic characteristics for identifying waterfowl. And then the tail and the tail base are very good as well. So just being able to know where those and reference where those different parts of the body are for waterfowl will be helpful, especially when you're looking at characteristics in the field guide and trying to identify what you see. Okay, so let's start off with our dabbling ducks or our pond ducks. So as I mentioned before, these are commonly known as puddle ducks. They prefer shallow water habitat for feeding on the surface. And they feed by dabbling or picking food off the water, or tipping, where you see them stick their head underwater and their butts up in the air. It's actually kind of fun to watch ducks do that if you've ever done so. And then one other interesting characteristic about these ducks is that they launch themselves upward when taking flight. And so they can take flight very rapidly. They just essentially jump out of the water and take off. And so, and in fact, that's very obvious if you ever watch dabbling ducks launch off the water. If you startle them off a marsh or a pond, you'll notice that they'll just basically jump right up out of the water and fly. And that's a good behavior to observe when identifying those ducks. Okay, so we'll start out with a really common one. I'm sure everybody that's on the presentation this afternoon has probably seen and knows of the mallard. The mallard is the most common duck in the world. The males have this very characteristic dark green head contrasting with this yellow bill. They have this nice chocolate brown breast and these kind of silvery gray sides and back. They're just a really stunning duck in my opinion. The females, much like females of many of our duck species that we'll talk about today, are brown overall. They have this very orangey kind of yellow bill, and they have this little black eye line. If you can see that on this female down here, there's a little line of black that goes right through the eye, kind of right through the center of the head, and those are good identifying characteristics for a female mallard. This image down here, which all of these speculum images have been taken from a field guide called Ducks at a Distance by Bob Hines, and I'll tell you how you can access that field guide at the end of the presentation today. But you'll notice, so this is what I'm talking about. If you can see my pointer there, the speculum of color here on the wing feathers. And this is a really good, again, diagnostic tool for identifying waterfowl species when they're in flight. So the mallard has this very characteristic bluish green speculum that's bordered both on the top and on the bottom with a line of white. And you can see that that there really is no difference in that speculum between the hen or the female and the drake or the male. And so when you see birds flying, looking for that flash of color in the middle of their wing can be really good identifying characteristic. Okay, the next species I wanted to talk about a bit is the northern pintail, another common species that we see during migration in Iowa, and an earlier migrant. So we tend to start to see pintails during fall migration in October and maybe still in November. And actually, pintails are the first species to start moving back through Iowa in the spring. Typically, we start to see pintails as early as late February. So these are a good species to know how to identify when you're looking at migratory flocks of waterfowl. They're named obviously for the long tail that we see in this male pintail down here on the lower right of the screen. Those males have, in addition to that long tail, they have this really nice kind of chocolate brown head that contrasts with a bright white throat. They have this bluish gray bill with the black line on it, nice silvery sides, just a really pretty duck and a favorite among both birders and waterfowl hunters alike. Females, again, they're darker brown above, but you can see that they start to transition into a lighter brown, kind of on the belly and on the lower breast. Both sexes have very long necks and very long, narrow wings, especially in flight. And so this species is really easy to identify in flight because they have those really long, narrow, pointy wings and a long, narrow neck. And I have an image of this later in the presentation that I can show you. You can see the differences between the female and the male speculums here on the wings. The male have that green kind of on the secondary feathers here, and then they have the gray above on the scapulars and on the upper ends of the primary feathers, whereas the females just have this kind of rusty colored speculum here on the lower part of the secondaries. One other thing to notice with the pintail is, and this is, I guess, kind of a personal observation that I like to use when identifying northern pintails, but their heads always seem to be somewhat small relative to their body. And I think it's very obvious here on this female pintail that's sitting on the ground. You'll notice that it looks like she just has this really kind of big rotund body and this tiny little head. And so that's, for some reason, that's something that's always struck out to me about pintails and a characteristic I've used to help identify them in the field. Okay, next is the northern shoveler. Again, a somewhat easy species to identify in the field because, as their name implies, they have a very large shovel-like bill. And even in this image of the male northern shoveler on the left and the female northern shoveler on the right, you can see, even at a distance, you can see just how big that shovel-like bill is. And that's probably the best diagnostic characteristic for this species, is that big bill. Males, much like the mallard, have this kind of dark green head, but they have a very bright white breast and throat. And then they also have these rusty colored sides, or flanks is what those are typically called. Females look very similar to a female mallard. They're brown overall with an orange bill, but again, that bill is just going to be much larger and very shovel-like or spatula-like on a shoveler than it is on a mallard. Both males and females have this green speculum with white above in flight, and the males also have this blue on the upper secondary, so they have this bluish coloration, but the green here, bright green, is what's really key on the males and the females of the northern shoveler. Okay, next let's talk a little bit about our teal species. So we see two species of teal typically in Iowa during migration. The blue-winged teal, which is above here on the right, and the green-winged teal, which is below. Both of these species, or basically all of the teals, are some of the smallest ducks that we see, and they're very fast flyers. And so oftentimes when you see teal flying, they're typically in small, compact flocks, and they fly really low on the water, and they're very agile in flight. They look like little duck fighter jets. Think of like a Cooper's hawk or a peregrine falcon. They're very agile in flight. Teal are very similar in that they seem to kind of zoom in and out of different places very quickly because of their small size and fast flight. The blue-winged teal, both sexes have blue scapulars on their wings, and the males have this distinct white face crescent that you can see up here on the upper picture of this male blue-winged teal. The green-winged teal, again, as the name implies, they have a distinct green speculum in flight, both the males and the females. The males have this really nice kind of rust-colored head with the green over the eye, and then they have this intricately patterned kind of silver and black barring on the sides. This is probably one of my most favorite duck species is the green-winged teal. I just think they're a very, very pretty duck, and I enjoy watching them in the wetlands. Okay, and I believe this is the last dabbling duck we're going to talk about, and that is the wood duck. Probably one of our most colorful ducks that we are lucky to see in Iowa every year. And I know Cynthia commented just on the beauty of this duck earlier, and I certainly do agree with that comment. The males are just very brightly colored, just with a variety of colors. You can kind of see this this male wood duck hiding, or at least trying to hide in the woods here, but it's hard for him to do because of his brightly colored head. But it's just a really, really pretty duck that's pretty obvious when you see one out in the woods or in the marsh. The females, on the other hand, again, much like most female ducks, they tend to be kind of brown overall. They do have a rusty breast with a white belly and a white teardrop around the eye, and that white teardrop around the eye is a really good diagnostic characteristic for a female wood duck. And in fact, you can see down here in the lower left part of this image, there is a female wood duck, and that white teardrop around her eye there is very distinctive. And so that's a very noticeable characteristic from a distance. In flight, wood ducks have really long square tails, and you can kind of see that in this image down here on the lower left. They have longer tails relative to many other duck species, and that's a really good identifying characteristic of wood ducks in flight, is that long square tail. The other interesting thing about wood ducks, which is a bit different from some of our other dabbling ducks, is that they're the one species, as their name suggests, that spend some time in wooded streams and ponds. They will utilize freshwater marshes, much like our other dabbling ducks, but they are the one species that will spend time in wooded areas, whereas most of the other dabbling ducks won't. And so if you're walking through the woods, particularly in the springtime, and you see what you think is a duck flying out of a tree or flying through the woods, chances are it's probably a wood duck, because they do nest in cavities in the spring, and they spend a lot of time checking out trees and trying to find the right cavity in the spring. So they're an interesting duck from a habitat standpoint. Okay, so let's talk a bit now about diving ducks. And again, as I mentioned before, our diving duck species are going to typically prefer deep water habitats. They need to have enough water to be able to dive down and search for the food that they need, things like submergent vegetation and fish and other freshwater creatures that are living on the bottoms of these larger lakes. They will also dive to escape threats. And so if you ever startle some ducks out on a wetland, diving ducks will often take flight, but sometimes they will just kind of dive underwater as well, which is a good, if you see something dive underwater, chances are it's probably a diving duck, right? I have here that they need a runway for taking flight. And this is kind of one of the fun things about diving ducks if you ever watch them. So if you remember before when we were talking about silhouettes, I had mentioned that most birds or ducks that spend a lot of time underwater have legs further back on their bodies than our dabbling ducks do. And that makes them very agile underwater, but unfortunately the trade-off of that adaptation is that it makes it a bit harder for them to take off and get flying. And so they kind of need to run on the water before they can just jump up and take flight. So they're very different from our dabbling ducks that can just launch themselves out of the water and go. Diving ducks need a bit of a runway or a bit of space in order to get up and fly. During migration, these diving duck species typically form large mixed flocks. And so oftentimes if you see a big group of ducks out on a large water body, say like Saylorville Reservoir down near Des Moines, there's probably multiple species of diving ducks and even dabbling ducks for that matter in that large flock. They're very social critters. Okay, so the first diving duck I want to talk about is the ringneck duck. And one of the things I noticed very quickly about the ringneck duck is they have this kind of pointy head. So you'll notice that their head, if you can see my pointer here on the image, if you trace the head up from the base of the bill up to the top, it looks like it just kind of comes to a bit of a point right at the top, which is different from really any other duck species. It's almost like they have a bit of a crest there, but they really don't. It's just kind of the shape of their head. The other thing that's very noticeable about the ringneck duck is their elaborate bill pattern. They kind of have this mixture of white and blue, and then some more white and black on the tip. Just a very, very pretty bill pattern. And if you're ever able to look at that up close, it's just very striking. The males have what I like to call the Nike swoosh of silver white on the sides. And you can kind of see how that silver and white traces the Nike swoosh, and it comes down and back up here. And that's a really good diagnostic characteristic for ringneck ducks, especially when you're looking at a mixed flock of ringneck ducks and lesser scaup, which I'll show on the next slide, that look very similar to ringneck ducks. The ringneck ducks have this Nike swoosh of green and white. The lesser scaup just has, or excuse me, gray and white. The lesser scaup just has straight gray and white. It just kind of goes across a straight line, and we'll see that on an image in the next slide. Females are brown overall with white around the eye. That's a good characteristic to note about the females. Again, that makes them, or allows you to differentiate a female ringneck duck from a female lesser scaup, which we'll see on the next slide. So remember that white around the eye. And in flight, the wings of both male and female ringneck ducks are dark. And you can see on this small image down here, when they're flying, the wings are pretty dark overall. And so remember that now when we move on to the lesser scaup, which you'll see down here on the lower right image, look very similar to a ringneck duck. However, you'll notice on the male, which is the bird furthest to the left, it has that white and gray on the sides, but it's just kind of a straight line. It doesn't have that Nike swoosh like what we see in the ringneck duck. The female, you'll notice, is just kind of a dark brown overall. It's hard to tell in this photo because it is at a distance, but there's really no white around the eye. The face is just dark, except for this little white face patch that's right at the base of the bill. So the scaup on the female has the white at the base of the bill. The female ringneck duck has the white around the eye. So good characteristics to distinguish these two species. Scaup are commonly known as bluebills, named for their kind of bluish gray bill that we see in both males and females. The males have an all black head, which you can see here in the image, have the white sides and the silver back. And then in flight, their wings have this white line. And so that's very different if we jump back. So we'll see the white line on the lesser scaup here. If we jump back to the ringneck duck, notice that there's really no white line there. It's just a very dark all black wing. So these are probably the two most challenging species, in my opinion, to distinguish in terms of our diving ducks. They look very similar, but there are some key characteristics that you can note for identifying and distinguishing between these two species. Okay, another diving duck that we see pretty commonly in Iowa is the redhead. Males, which we see down here on the right of the image, have this gray body with a black breast, black rear, and this really pretty red head with kind of a contrasting goldish yellow eye. Both sexes have this bluish gray bill with the black tip. That blue-gray bill is pretty common among most of our diving duck species that we see in Iowa. One of kind of an interesting fact, not necessarily related to identification, but the redhead is really the only duck species that regularly utilizes parasitism during the nesting season. So what I mean by that is that they'll actually find nests of other ducks and lay their eggs in those nests, kind of much like what we know about the brown-headed cowbird, which is a songbird that relies solely on nest parasitism as a breeding strategy. Redheads will build their own nests, but they do commonly parasitize nests of other ducks, much more so than some of our other nesting duck species. So just kind of an interesting fact about that neat species. Okay, now we'll talk a bit about the canvasback, which you'll notice right away looks very similar to the redhead on the previous slide. However, there are some things on the canvasback that I think are very distinctive. The first of which is this really shallow sloping forehead with a long flat bill. So you'll see that they really don't have a distinct or abrupt forehead. It kind of just all slopes right down into the bill. They're a very large bodied duck, more so than some of the other diving ducks that we've talked about already this afternoon. Males have this chestnut head with the black breast and rear, and their sides are much more white than what we see on the redhead, which tends to be a bit more gray. Females, interestingly enough, look very similar to the males in terms of coloration, as you can see here, but they just have this brown head rather than the red head that the male has. And so they're very female canvasbacks are actually probably one of the easiest female ducks to identify, just based on plumage characteristics, because they look pretty similar to the males. Okay, one more diving duck here that I want to talk about, and then we'll kind of wrap things up here, is the hooded merganser. And the reason that I wanted to mention the hooded merganser this afternoon is because this is actually one of diving duck species that's a bit different from some of our other diving ducks, and it's a diving duck species that nests pretty commonly in Iowa, and they nest in tree cavities much like our wood ducks do. So both the males and the females have a distinct crest on their head, which is pretty common among the mergansers. And you'll notice that the male, so I've got two male hooded mergansers in the image here, and then a female hooded merganser here that's kind of hidden behind this second male. And you can see that crest very obviously on the female, and then also pretty obvious on the male. Much like the wood ducks, hooded mergansers have square tails, and they have long skinny heads and a pointy bill in flight, and you can see that in this image here. It's a very good characteristic when seeing hooded mergansers in flight, especially that long skinny head and skinny kind of needle-like bill. They're very similar in terms of habitat preferences to wood ducks. As I mentioned before, they do nest in tree cavities, and so they will spend some time in wooded marshes and streams, much like the wood ducks do. Okay, and then I just wanted to wrap up with a few other diving ducks here that we see pretty commonly in Iowa during migration. In the upper right here, we have the common goldeneye, kind of an interesting bill that they have, a little short stubby bill with that white cheek patch on the males, and much like their name implies, they have that very bright gold eye that you can kind of see in the image there. We have the ruddy duck down here in the lower center. The best characteristic for a ruddy duck is that stiff little tail that's sticking straight up in the air. That is characteristic of that species. No other duck, to my knowledge, that we see in Iowa has that stiff upright tail. And so if you see that on a tiny little duck out in the water, and the duck is diving under the water, then chances are it's a ruddy duck. And then we do also lastly have The bufflehead, which is this is a picture of a male bufflehead up here in the upper left corner of the screen. A quite striking duck, actually, with the contrasting black and white on the sides and then that nice white head patch. All three of these species are very small. They're the smallest of the diving ducks that we see in Iowa. And so and they dive very quickly. So if you're looking at ducks that are pretty small in terms of body size and they're diving very quickly under the water, chances are you're looking at one of these three species. Okay, so that wraps up our duck species. Let's talk just really briefly here about a few other species that we see in the group of geese and swans. So as many of us, I'm sure, probably already know, these species are much larger overall than our duck species. What's different about these species from the ducks that we see is that the males and the females appear similar. There's no plumage differences between the males and the females of any of the species that we're going to talk about next. They feed very similar to puddle ducks in that they're feeding, picking food off the water and perhaps tipping under their head underwater very briefly to get food that's in shallow water marshes. But what's different about these birds is that they will also feed on land. And Canada geese in particular are often seen grazing on grass, even in mowed yards. And trumpeter swans, which we'll talk about, will feed in crop fields typically. And so we'll see these birds feeding on land just as much as we will on the water. And as I mentioned before, when we were talking about flocking behavior, these are the birds that we often see in large flocks and flying in loose bees. So remember that when you're seeing a flock of waterfowl flying over, that if it's flying in a bee, chances are it's probably geese or perhaps swans. So the first two species I want to talk about are the Canada and cackling goose. Very tricky species in the field because they look almost identical. However, they are different species. The cackling goose is quite a bit smaller overall in body size than the Canada goose. And the key distinguishing characteristic between these two species is the bill. So if you'll notice on the Canada goose here in the upper image, has that really long, kind of flat bill. Whereas the cackling geese on the lower image here have that very short, stubby bill. And the reason for that is that these two species, despite looking very similar and using very similar habitats, their foraging habits are quite different. Canada geese are grazers, as I mentioned before. They're going to be clipping grass off that's above the ground, whereas cackling geese are they kind of root around a bit more. They'll actually stick that stubby little bill underneath the surface of the soil and grab roots and kind of uproot plants in that manner, much like a snow goose will forage. And so their bills are adapted for how they forage. In both of these species, as I'm sure many of you have seen many of them across Iowa, they have that all black head and neck with the white cheek patch. The bodies are brown with a kind of a white rump or white at the rear. And as I mentioned before, the Canada goose is much larger overall in body size than the cackling goose. One other thing to note about both of these species is that they're very vocal in flight, and that's actually quite typical of many of the larger waterfowl species, including swans. They're making a lot of noise when they're flying overhead, and so it's a very good characteristic to note of these species. And then the last species of the day that we're going to talk about is probably my favorite of all waterfowl species, and that is the trumpeter swan. It's the largest waterfowl species that we see in North America, and it's even much larger than a snow goose. Snow geese and trumpeter swans are often confused. Many folks that see trumpeter swans think that they're snow geese, and in fact, a single outstretched wing of a trumpeter swan is about the length of an entire snow goose. And so these are just really massive birds, and they're just unmistakable when you see them fly over just how big they are. They are all white, but they have this black bill and black feet. The juveniles, however, which we see on the lower left image here, can be a bit more gray, and oftentimes if they're really young, they'll have a pink bill, but as they start to get older, they start to transition into the black bill, much like the adults. One interesting fact about trumpeter swans is they're actually a really neat conservation success story in Iowa. They were nearly extirpated from Iowa, and since about the mid 1990s, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources embarked on a very widespread and intensive restoration effort, and we're now seeing a great population growth in this species in Iowa once again. So it's a really neat success story, and thanks in part to the DNR and its many collaborators on this really important reintroduction effort. So we're lucky to see this really neat species in Iowa once again. Okay, so let's just wrap up here and recap on some of the keys to identifying waterfowl. So one of the things I mentioned first and foremost is to know your dabblers and divers. Be able to know the different species in each of those duck groups and be able to distinguish them based on habitat and behavior. And we talked a little bit about how to do that this afternoon. Again, silhouettes, shapes, and sizes are critical at a distance. And so, you know, the best way to learn those is not only looking at a field guide, but just spend some time in the field. And, you know, the nice thing about ducks when they're out on the water is they are typically staying in one spot. And so they do offer the opportunity to just sit and study them and look at the shapes and sizes of the different species and just really familiarize yourself with them, because that'll make identification much easier in the future. Flight and flocking behavior can help greatly for waterfowl, because oftentimes we are seeing them fly overhead, and so it's good to kind of know what you're looking at when they're flying over. But as I mentioned, you know, color really seals the deal. If you can get up close and personal, or either by walking up to them or looking at them through some high-powered optics, color is really what's going to help us in distinguishing which species we're looking at. So these are I think the 4 key tips that I can provide for identifying waterfowl. And I also want to remind folks, you know, have fun. I know that sometimes looking at ducks at a distance can be a bit frustrating, but I like to see it as a fun challenge, and I encourage you to do the same. There are, as I mentioned before, some really great resources for identifying ducks specifically. As I mentioned, all the images for the speculum of different species and birds in flight are obtained from Ducks at a Distance by Bob Hines. This is a free digital resource that you can find online. If you just simply Google search Ducks at a Distance, you can find a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website that allows you to download the PDF of this field guide. And it's a bit dated, but it is still a really great resource for identifying ducks. The common, well-known Crossley guide now has a waterfowl version, and I have not actually gotten one of these guides at hand yet, but I have a number of friends who, in the waterfowl world, who have purchased this guide and say that it's just a really great guide. The nice thing about the Crossley guide is it does provide you with photographs rather than artistic images, and so it's a bit of more of a realistic rendition of what some of these species look like in their habitats. And then Cornell Labs Ornithology is All About Birds website. It's just a really great free resource, kind of a one-stop shop to learn a bit about how to identify different ducks and learn more about the habitats they use and where they nest. So I would encourage you to look at that resource online as well. Okay, so we're going to wrap up today with a quiz. And I know this is recorded, and so we're going to do it a little bit differently. But what I will do now is I'll show an image of a duck, and I'll give you 3 seconds to identify it. And you can identify it, either write it down or just have your thoughts in mind. And after 3 seconds are up, I'll tell you what we're looking at. And so we'll be able to quiz ourselves here on what we've learned today. So, okay, let's get started. This is going to be fun. Here's our first duck. We'll count to 3 here. 1, 2, 3. Okay, the duck has flown away. What did we notice about that duck? Well, it was very colorful, right? Had that very bright orange bill, very colorful head overall. Hopefully many of you recognize that duck as a male or a Drake wood duck. That was a Drake wood duck. Okay, let's move on to our next image. 1, 2, and 3. This duck, I'll give you a hint, has dove under the water and disappeared from us. So that should tell you now that you can narrow your choices down to the diving ducks. And if you remember, that duck had the nice Nike swoosh of gray and white along its side. And we talked about that Nike swoosh on the male ringneck duck. So this was a male ringneck duck, one of our diving duck species that we learned about today. Okay, ready for the next image? Here we go. 1, 2, and 3. So what do we notice about that duck right away? It's brown overall, so that suggests to us that it's probably a female of one of our species. But I hope you noticed one other thing about that duck, and that was the big shovel-like bill. And that should be the one characteristic that tips you off. That was a female northern shoveler. Okay, and here's our next image. So this one's a little bit trickier. 1, 2, and 3. Those ducks have flown away now. So what do we notice about the ducks in that image? Well, they were in flight. So that kind of provides us with a bit of a different perspective in terms of identification. But a few things that I noticed. One, notice that some of those ducks had a very long pin-like tail. They had very long necks, and they have very long, narrow wings. So I'll flash right back to that image. Notice the long tail sprig here, very long, pointy wings compared to other ducks, and long necks. So hopefully you're all thinking that this is a flock of northern pintails, and we have some males in here and some females. So it's a mixed male and female flock of northern pintails. Okay, so that concludes our quiz for this afternoon and concludes our program. Again, I thank you very much for attending, and thanks on behalf of Iowa Young Birders and Wild Birds Unlimited for your interest in this program this afternoon. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties there in the middle. We will put this video on our Wild Birds Unlimited YouTube page for folks to view afterwards. And if you do have any questions about today's presentation that you weren't able to answer, do please feel free to email us, and we will be happy to answer those. So again, thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy a fun fall and some fun waterfowling here in the very near future. Take care.